Ace Attorney is a favourite franchise of mine, but one I always struggle to recommend. I mean, you play as a lawyer, but lack any prestige or respect. You investigate crimes, but spend most of your time in a courtroom. And gameplay is making choices, but there's always a right answer, and the story itself is incredibly linear.
But it's great, cathartic and satisfying and fun, and it's difficult to pinpoint exactly why. Well, one can avoid this by just discussing and praising the various components of the franchise, its excellent characters, stories, and music. Any fan of the series knows these games are much more than simply the sum of their parts. Without the system of gameplay to bind them together, you just have a weird, repetitive anime with bad animation, and no one wants that. So this video was made to get into how these titles work, what makes them engaging, why is it fun. Although I should mention, I'll only today be talking about the structures and gameplay of the first game, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, to keep things simple and leave future developments for another time. Although, as the core structure is mostly unchanged, these points do apply to future entries. And by first game, I mean first 4 cases of it. Rise from the Ashes was created after the Japan-only GBA version was released, specifically for the DS, and follows a different design philosophy, so I won't be discussing it here for simplicity's sake / me not liking it. Also, although I won't be specifically discussing the story, I will draw off examples within it, so spoiler warnings for plot points of the first game.
And without further ado, why it fun?
Part 1. Courtroom Dynamics. Ace Attorney is set in a dystopian future, or I guess past now, where the fragile legal system is co-opted and controlled by a cabal of egotistical megalomaniacs who lie and cheat to convict defendants for their own personal statuses and agendas.
It lays it on pretty thick too. The game starts with a murderer in the heat of a crime deciding on the fly to frame a random bystander, then cuts to a trial of you defending that bystander for the murder.
But it's not merely the fact that evil thrives that makes the courtroom effective. The careful framing of it keeps the player engaged by making every action feel necessary and meaningful through establishing 3 core principles. The system is broken, the system is worth fixing, and you are the only one who can fix it. You play as a defense attorney, defending your innocent clients, arguing against the case made by the police and presented by the prosecutor in a debate mediated by an impartial judge who draws the final verdict. Evidence and witnesses are prepared by the prosecution, and they also manage the case itself, handing orders to the detectives. It's a system which seems fair, but ultimately rests on the moral character of the prosecutors, who are shown to act anything but morally. Really, the prosecutors in the first game are the villains as much as the murderers, specifically Von Karma, who turns out to also be a murderer, and the shadow of Von Karma's philosophy you fight in your main adversary, Miles Edgeworth. These are characters who work to convict criminals out of ego and pride, who've deluded themselves into thinking that because they are on the side of the law, their actions are always justifiable up to and including forging evidence, weaponizing the witnesses into removing unhelpful details, and controlling the pace of the court by manipulating the spineless judge. As in real life. The police are also villains, not in the sense they are individually evil, the only one you see is a pretty nice guy, but that they work under the thumb of the prosecutor's office and are therefore working against you and on the sides of the ones obfuscating the truth through false evidence. The one you meet, Gumshoe, is also weak and malleable like the judge, and can thus act as a kind of shield for the prosecutions being called out on dodgy behaviour or mistakes, where if he's there, they'll make him the fall guy. There's a brilliant scene early on where the imbalance is laid bare, when the detective's account of a murder contradicts evidence in the autopsy report, and Edgeworth responds by presenting a fresh, implied fake autopsy report he knows will be accepted because everyone in the room bar you are effectively under his spell. Still, yours and Phoenix's resolves are kept strong because most individuals within the system are essentially good people, albeit put in awkward situations. And that feeling of affecting positive change for decent, likable people is a big motivator playing through.
This structure where the prosecutor controls the judge, controls the police, and manipulates the witnesses to the point they might as well be working with or even be the murderer, but where you as defense have space and power to make your case, is a genius framework for this kind of game because it creates the perfect underdog story, but where you're still able to win within the rules of the system you're a part of.
Most of what makes visual novels tick is feeling, and all this makes the game feel much better. Every action you take is important, necessary, and righteous, and thus the game becomes more engaging throughout, and especially satisfying when you finally turn it around in an obviously scripted sequence, but that still feels remarkable and against the odds, tying you to the world and its consequences without Phoenix Wright himself needing to be the greatest protagonist. Part 2, Phoenix Wright is the greatest protagonist. Okay, I know I wanted to avoid discussing specific characters, but Wright is just too perfect. And the reasons he is perfect in writing and characterization feed directly into why the game works as a whole, and allow him to act both as a perfect conduit and power fantasy. Namely, that he is out of place, perpetually on the defensive, and can shit talk like a motherfucker. You start as a total rookie, Phoenix's first trial, and you even learn with him how courts work because of nerves, I guess. Sure, I'll bite. His inexperience in the courtroom and general awkwardness outside it are important for making him relatable in this wacky world of bizarre characters. He's still kind of a goofball, but to build that player-conduit relationship key to the game working is that he reacts to things like a normal person would. Like you would, even. And the game makes sure to have this link be strong enough before it stops dropping in aspects of Phoenix's past that then serve to make him more interesting without sacrificing that bond. The other key method of keeping Phoenix and the player on the same page is bluffing. Now, because of the aforementioned dynamics in court, Wright is constantly backed into corners on the defensive. Fucking cut that. But to keep in some semblance of control, he's constantly forced to pretend he's worked out more than he has, right up until he's called out and has to prove it.
But the trick is, you as a player don't know how much he's figured out either, so you can project onto him at any stage only as much as you've figured out.
It's a rare example of semantic distance actually bringing you closer to a character. His mastery of the bluff, even to himself in inner monologue, creates an ambiguity you can just insert yourself right in without thinking. When you don't know something, you can assume he doesn't either, and when you crack the riddle, you're discovering it together, and both merely pretending you haven't to keep your cool, you crafty lawyers, you. And finally, power fantasies tend to get a bad rep for their overuse and more problematic connotations, but in moderation they can add to a narrative experience. For Phoenix, it's his dramatic put-down one-liners. You bond with him through shared vulnerabilities, his reactions to being overwhelmed, scared, or creeped out, so it makes it all the more compelling to see an argument you clearly thought of to get the story this far executed in the most masterfully gratifying form. A good example is in the very first case. He's this nervous wreck throughout, then finally comes together once you have all the pieces combined. Proof enough for you, Mr. Saw It? Or should I say, Mr. Did It? And he just passes out because he's been owned so hard with facts and logic. I just love it. Phoenix Wright is an intricate part of why the game works, by balancing the fine line between a blank canvas and badass hero to keep players both engaged and satisfied throughout. It works well, and within the framing of the courtroom serves to make the gameplay ever more involving and enjoyable. Part 3. Structural Minimalism. Scratch that. The flow, yo. Scratch that. Structural minimalism.
Much of the mainstream criticism of Ace Attorney centers on the minimalist gameplay as a flaw that should be fixed. But what they don't understand, and what many of the future games don't seem to understand, is that the aggressive linearity, in fact most gameplay boils down to navigating menus, aren't flaws, they're some of its greatest advantages.
By keeping gameplay interaction at the minimum amount to establish player agency and piecing the case together, the games allow a pace and rhythm where gameplay only amplifies the satisfaction garnered from the writing and characters, and knows when not to get in the way. Beyond simple menu navigation, reading dialogue, and choosing topics to discuss with witnesses, all the interaction you have with the game is all that's necessary to prove you as a player are following on. Before presenting a piece of evidence to a witness in an investigation, or to counter a statement made in a cross-examination, you often need to connect bits of logic together in your head first before working out what to do. And despite how easy it would be for the game to force you to piece together every step, that the game doesn't provides the writing more ability to set the pace, which is only ever a good thing, and allows the game to go in weirder, more interesting directions. One complaint leveled to these games I do agree with though is that they're not good at dealing with failure states, i.e. dealing with how the game responds when you choose an incorrect answer. Given the linearity, it can't meaningfully penalize you, so it has to give kind of a pretend penalty with some dialogue added about how wrong you are, where if you fail 5 times the defendant automatically gets declared guilty and you have to reload a save state to try again. It's very empty without there being a real punishment, and significantly breaks the flow when you're in the zone to have to whiplash back into Phoenix is an idiot mode before resuming. But in a way, that kind of is the punishment. You become so engrossed in the rhythm and revelations of the story, the jarring failure states acts as motivation in itself to pay attention and keep on top of the plot, to the extent it's barely even a problem. Simply, Ace Attorney's mechanics know when to pull back and only test your reasoning enough to feel responsible for what's being said, while allowing the gameplay to mostly melt into the background, which keeps the game fresh and immersive throughout. Part 4. Suspense and Payoff. Following building your connection to the protagonist, creating a broken world you can meaningfully reform, and amplified by a pacing and flow created by its minimalist gameplay, the satisfaction of Ace Attorney is then compounded through a constant escalation of tension, suspense, and release, built through every component the game throws at you. The arguments, the music, the graphics, and the reversal of character dynamics. Firstly, the arguments carry greater payoff for how thoroughly you as a player are involved in following through each piece of evidence, often from first spotting and obtaining it at the crime scene itself. Honestly, the investigations aren't great in the first game, but they do show the skeleton of something better. The biggest problem is how aimless they feel. Given beyond solve the murder, there's rarely any indication of what short-term objective to pursue next. You're mostly left to just bumble through locations at random, triggering events.
Now, if only the sequels could fix this by streamlining investigations while giving the player a more active role with some kind of magic green stone.
Nevertheless, they add credence and weight to the revelations of the trials by attaching you more directly to the characters and evidence, failing as individual gameplay chunks but working as part of the greater system. They build to the ever-growing suspense of each case and amplify the payoff of eventually justifying why a piece of evidence is important, which then all serves as greater suspense, building for the yet more satisfying payoff of connecting an obscure detail of that same evidence to recontextualize it to deliver the conclusive blow ending the case. My favourite example being how in the fourth case, you first use a metal detector to find Larry's air canister in Gourd Lake, but then at the end of the case, it becomes your surprise weapon, presented where no other evidence would fit, to prove no bullet from the DL6 incident could be found by proving the bullet is still in Von Karma's shoulder. Now, the soundtrack is brilliant, not because all the songs are individually good, in fact, many of them are kind of bad, but because together they work to contain the tension, suiting the mood, and then guiding your adrenaline as each trial reaches its crescendo. The game, and every subsequent Ace Attorney game, has for this a series of songs it cycles through, building energy as it goes. Trial theme to cross-examination, to objection, to the faster cross-examination allegro theme to confess the truth.
All building up to the most recognizable song of each game, the most iconic reward for your efforts, the Pursuit theme, which then cuts out and comes back with a new intro and more instrumentation, and it's just so good, so much passion, just gets you in the mood for hell yeah man, let's do some crime. I mean, solve some crime.
The game even holds back offering you new animations until the right moment, keeping a fairly limited few sprites until you reach the sadistically satisfying pain animations and comical breakdowns. And finally, to bring this whole thing full circle, the courtroom dynamics and their eventual reversal in each case's finale. You play as the underdog, knowing the tables will turn in the climax, but they sure know how to edge you till you get there. Although technically the defense only needs to prove the defendant's innocence, the prosecutors who control the courtrooms continually move the goalposts such that you end up proving much more. And it's in this desperation to go further, which you can always somehow pull out of your hat, that leads to some of the best moments in the series, like cross-examining a parrot. Although, as a quick sidebar, this element of how satisfying it is to totally follow the case through isn't perhaps best demonstrated in the first game specifically, not for any mechanical reason, but more, there's only 4 cases, and in 2 of them they're ended with Mia and Edgeworth's help respectively. So take this point more as why the sequels are good, / why Turnabout Goodbyes is so much fun specifically. Suspense is the last piece of the puzzle for why Ace Attorney is fun. Each gameplay choice and piece of evidence rightly presented feels so much more exciting from the various cycles of overlapping suspense and payoff it presents you with, and how the games know to hold off the climax for maximum effect at the greatest point. It is, to me, the most effective factor in how these dumb lawyer games work.
If it's not obvious enough, Ace Attorney is a series I greatly enjoy and would recommend to anyone.
With its courtroom dynamics to make you feel small yet significant, its protagonist to make you feel connected yet empowered, the minimalist gameplay to keep an engaging pace, and the philosophy of long suspense and payoff imbued into every element to amplify the satisfaction from all aspects of its gameplay and design, you're sure to have a swell time.
Of course, all of it will be little without the solid characters, music and writing, but that's a video for another time, and here I just wanted to shine some light on the less sexy but equally important parts of its construction, which is what I think makes Ace Attorney work, and what makes Ace Attorney fun.
Thank you for watching this Ace Attorney analysis. Next one will be on the gimmicks and developments to the formula subsequent games in the main series bring. If you enjoyed this video, follow me on Twitter. I don't care about subs anymore. This whole channel was a goddamn Ponzi scheme, a cheap ruse for Twitter fame. I made a bet 5 years ago and I'm not even halfway what I need to be. Just come on, just give me a... please.